And as I went through this story in my mind, I realized that I think that's where the belief of that has come from. You know, to experience a horse with such will and such a spirit for wanting to do what he was bred and put on this earth, I believe, to do, was an empowering thing to experience. And that's what stayed with me for such a long time. So guys, welcome back. Welcome back to this being the second episode of TRT the Podcast. I'm just super happy and excited to be bringing this podcast to you today. It's a story that means a lot to me. A lot of the people in the podcast that I mentioned don't know that I'll be mentioning them. I will be telling stories about previous memory and experiences in my life. I also see by going through and preparing for these podcasts that it's really a way of recording past events and memories that are maybe lost. A little bit like writing a book, writing a journal. These moments in time that maybe my kids will go back and listen to, or hopefully you guys get a little bit of interesting listening time out of. And yeah, recording my memories, things that have happened in my life. And this episode, I think, will be a recurring episode. This particular episode is about horses, an influential horse in my life. So looking at those influential horses, of course, all horses have an influence and a special, but there's always those few that are really special and leave a mark and actually change the way that I look at horses and my belief system in training horses and my methodology that's created. And of course, that's how your life goes with your certain influences. So yeah, I think this will be a recurring episode. I've studied hard. I'm going to try to follow this story as much as I can. I've got all my notes here to make sure that I stick to the story. It's also an interesting process for me to write down. I write the whole memory down, and I also go through and check that the facts are right and my memory's serving me well. So today's memory, takes me back to the time in Nanagoon around 2005, 2006, where, I was building my own business, my own property, and I was breaking in horses and doing problem horses and training my own dressage horses. I also at that time was riding for Jim and Emmy Schmall from Heatherton Park. Jim and Emmy were a great support for me in my early career. They were both incredible life mentors, not only in the business of horses, but in life in general. I was at a time where I was starting up my own business. At 25, I owned my own property and I was building a business there, building a stable. And at that age, you can make a lot of mistakes. You can very quickly fall flat on your face. So yeah, Jim and Emmy were really a great gift in that period of my life. And there's, a lot of the skills and the advice they'd given me, I still take with me now. And I'm eternally grateful for the time that I had with them. Before, Jim and Emmy had a property there in Cranbourne South. And I was driving back and forward from my own property in Nanagoon and also riding for Jim and Emmy. We had a lot of success with young horses at that time. And yeah, we were working all kinds of horses from all kinds of places. And before they had that property, Jim and Emmy had Heatherton Park, also one of the largest spelling racing horse stables at that time. And so they were very well connected to, a lot of people in the racing industry, some of the best trainers in the country. And Jim called me up and said to me, well, there's going to be a really well-respected racehorse trainer calling you from Caulfield. And he wants you to, to do a little work with a fiery young mare that he's got. And very soon after, I got the first call from Colin Little, the first contact I had with Colin Little. Now, I knew who Colin was. I sort of grew up, my mother worked in a racing stable and we were heavily sort of steeped in the racing industry. Mum was working with trotters, but we'd also been in stables with gallopers and racehorses. I rode track work as a young fella, from around the ages of 13, 16. So I sort of knew the industry a little bit. I was brought up by going to the stable with Mum, and you go to the races. We were going to Moonee Valley, and I was running around causing havoc at the races as a young fella. And Mum also worked for what was then called 3UZ. 3UZ was a racehorse radio station, so I was listening a lot, and I knew the names of trainers and jockeys and sort of horses going around at that time. And then later in my life, my father-in-law, Rob Horan, a tremendous fella, he owned a TAB in Gloucester Avenue in Berwick. I still remember my wife at that time, Christy, telling me when they were growing up, her and her brother on Melbourne Cup Day and Spring Carnival would be running around as kids helping the adults, fill out their betting tickets. And since then, of course, a lot of the small TABs had been closed down, and they were opening up the sort of sports bars and opening up tabs and pokies and sort of joining those things together in pubs and bigger venues. And my two brother-in-laws at that time, Ricky and Shane, they were sort of keen amateur punters, and so our weekends often looked like, after a game of golf, going down to the pub and having some beers and having a punt. My two brother-in-laws, two top fellas, they always good for a laugh. We'd sort of, on the weekends go in and be in the pub there, and they were actually quite good punters and were often winning money rather than me sort of walking in there, being the horse guy, but not having so much experience or interest in the betting. But, I just remember moments of being in there and they were sort of up and high in energy and sort of a lot of banter. And I would walk up to the EBT machine, which is like an automated machine where you could basically put your money in and be able to choose, races from the dogs, the trots or the gallops anywhere in Australia. And then you would sit in the TAB, and all of you Aussies will know this, of course. It's a strong culture there in Australia. Where you could sit there and you'd watch on all the TV screens the races as it was going along. And so I'd be there at the TV machine, and they'd be taking the piss, going, "No, hey Tucker, you know which button to press? Do you know which race you're betting on?" So I was never very successful at it, but often also we'd be going down to the local races at Pakenham or Spring Carnival, either at Caulfield, Moonee Valley or Flemington or something like that. And Rick would always often say, "Come on, Tucker Bags, pick me a winner, will ya?" And we'd go down to the mounting yard, and he'd be going, "Oh, Tucker, that looks like a good one, doesn't it?" And I'd be looking, of course, through dressage eyes, thinking, "Yeah, that one's, pick out the one that was good looking and shiny," not knowing whether it was any good at running or not, but having a sense that he was athletic. And, sometimes we had the luck. I would gain a bit of value through being able to try to pick a winner for the brother-in-laws. But really, good times, and that was also a part of my life. You have the names of things. Driving in between Jim and Emmy's, often between Nanagoon and driving to their place. My father-in-law at that time was then working at Berwick Springs Hotel in the sports bar, and he's a manager of sports bar and tab. And I was pretty close to my father-in-law. He was a really likable fella. Anybody that knew Rob Horan from those days in the TAB, everybody that walked in knew him. He was just that kind of guy. And that was kind of in between Nanagoon and Cranbourne South, where I used to go to Jim and Emmy's. And if it was around lunchtime, I'd always call in, and he'd set me up on the bar with a counter meal, with either chicken parm and chips or a T-bone steak, and I'd have a pot of beer. Of course, that's what you do at lunchtime in Australia when you're in between jobs. And and then I would sort of sit and also watch the screens. And so, constantly I was familiar with what was going on in the racing and who was successful and where the big trainers were. And Rob would also, on the weekends, he'd pull out the form guide out of the middle of the newspaper, and that was always sitting. If I went round to their place for dinner with Christy, then, the form guide was always sitting there, and sometimes you would pick up and you'd read and you go through the names. And they were, of course, all very up with the horses and the trainers and the jockeys. And I was out of the loop a little bit with it, but, you sort of get to know who the high-profile trainers were. So I was aware who Colin Little was, and the first time came when Colin went to bring a horse to me. That was this little red mare that was fiery. Jim called me up and had said that Colin would be calling, and he called up and he said that he needed to bring this little mare down. So I said, yeah, no worries, and had a bit of an idea who Colin was. And I just remember when he came to drop the horse off, or the horse would generally come on the truck, and then, that afternoon or a day or a couple of days later, Colin would call in. And I remember the first time I met Colin, he had driven down the road in his black Mercedes. He came in the stable, and the man immediately impressed me. He was the kind of man that made you immediately forget what you thought you knew about him and his success in racing. And you were presented with a man that would have the left hand behind the back, and he leaned in and shook my hand confidently and firmly, that you had the feeling he was a man that was believable and you could trust him. He was always very neatly dressed, neatly presented, and he always gave you that sense that he was the real deal. And that was the same from the first day I met Colin till the last time I'd met him. He would always shake my hand in that way. If I was going later on to the stable and meeting him at the track, he would always just come out and straight. The first thing he did was always shake hands, and that's also something that sort of stuck with me over the time. People you meet that you respect, you adopt these traits that give you the sense and the feeling of being respected or respecting others. And he would always come and he would always tell me, the character of the horse. He came and he'd say about this little red mare that how she was in the stable, how she was in the mornings going to the track, how she would sort of walk to the training in the morning. He knew how they were in the stable in the morning, during the day, in the evening. And I was always impressed about how much he knew about the character of his horses. And he would sort of go through and he would always tell me sort of the success they'd had and, how much money they'd made, which from that moment on, Colin's horses sort of developed the skill in me that I could hear a mouse fart in the stable from my bed in the middle of the night, being nervous that if something happened in the stable, you'd be like, oh, he's one of those horses, getting out, or, it immediately put me on edge. So I worked this first little fiery red mare I got from him, and, Colin he would visit, every, couple of days or once a week or something like that. And Colin would always call up and say, Tristan, how's it going? How's the horse doing? And, oh, I'm just in the neighborhood. Do you mind if I drop in? And I'd be thinking, what? He's just in the neighborhood. He's an hour's drive from Caulfield to Nanagoon. So I'd run like mad and always, brush and polish the horses up and put a fresh Dressage with the Stars blanket on him. And I'd always make sure that Colin's horses were the first one in the stable. They were in stable number 1. I had a small stable block at that time of 7 stables, American style barn, which is a fancy way of saying I had a colorbond shed, a metal shed, in the shape and style of an American barn, with a tack room at one end and the feed room and the wash bay at the other. And although it was a sort of glorified shed, which actually a good friend of mine, Chris Bell from Eckland, came down and we spent a couple of days putting it up ourselves. I remember it was an old dairy at that time. We had 2 really big gum trees out the front, and I needed that space to extend where the old herringbone dairy used to be. And I got another bloke from down the road with the excavator to come in and clean up the old dairy. And we took the 2 gum trees down from out the front, made some nice firewood and made a few benches and some furniture out of the nice red gum. And we were putting in the footings, Chris and I, and we set everything out. And then the guy from the council drives down the road, and he slows down, and nobody drove down that road. You know, there was only 2 blokes that ever drove down that road, and that was Chatfields, the 2 old blokes, Ron and John and Jim, actually, the 3 brothers, driving back and forwards to their cattle and their potatoes on that road. Another group of fellas that old blokes with local knowledge that helped me out a lot in those early days. And so it was strange that a car would come down and pull up. And it's very fitting now, actually, telling a story about Australia. If you hear buzzing, this is the flies that have joined our conversation to make this very authentic. And the council bloke drove down the road and he said, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Oh, we're putting, you know, some stables up." And I got an old coffee pad, you know, and drew the map out. And he sort of said, "Oh, one moment, you probably need a stamp for that." Went back to the car, came out, stamped the coffee pad and said, "Righto, good luck, see ya." And that was the end of that. And we put the stables up, and Chris had sort of left me about 500 tech screws to put in the roof, which I probably put a few in to tack it down. And to this day, I never went back and put the rest of them in. Really busy with the horses, so they're probably still sitting in the bucket somewhere. But the inside of the stables were really my pride and joy. You know, I had Graham McIver from Stable Systems at that time, a great guy, great engineer with a great mind. Spent many hours sitting with Graham talking over ideas, and he always would have a cold tinny in the fridge, normally a VB, something that most humans probably wouldn't drink these days, but it was always a refreshing and good talk with Graham. And they were state of the art, you know, stainless steel, spring-loaded bar to open the stables. They were sliding doors with red jarrah, like red jarrah hardwood in the doors. And I remember employing a guy from a lift shafts company. He had this building system where he'd build a wall with plastic panels and pour concrete. And he could pour a concrete wall like, I don't know, like 7 meters high in one pour. So I had this idea that I'd get this guy in and I formed the bar, and Graham put all the bars perfectly precise within the millimeter up for me. Beautiful vinyl coated wheels that you could slide the doors. You heard no noise. And then I had this concrete build up. And then Rick, my good punting brother-in-law, was working as a renderer at that time. So I got him to sort of render the walls, put a nice coating of cream sand render over the concrete. And I mean, the inside of those stables at that time for me was like the Taj Mahal. I'd built this marble palace for my horses to go in, realizing I'd then spent many years without stables. And when I got stables, realized I just created a lot more work for myself, but it enabled me to have horses from people like Colin Little. So I, you know, getting into those stables, you know, working the horses out of those stables was my life every morning. So getting horses in like that, I was alone a lot. So I was only there working the horses, getting up in the morning, bring a certain amount of horses in, start to ride them, put them out in the field, take a coffee, you know, it's 40 degrees, take the next 5 out, work those ones in the sand arena that I'd placed out the back. And the time came that then the little red mare was ready to go back. She went back then to the track at Collins, and I had agreed with Colin that I would go to the track and ride the mare a few times there at Caulfield. So I'd get up 4:30 in the morning, or be there around 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning to ride her the first two times at Colin's place to sort of test out and show his riders what the new buttons were like. And I remember going down the race the first time. The race, you sort of come from the stables, walk along a sand track, and you go underneath what is the Caulfield race course, which is the city track, the grass track, and you go under the racetrack to get to the middle, where the training tracks are. And I just remember going down the race, and these two young guys riding in the opposite direction were sort of laughing to themselves and said, "Well, we won't see him come back again." I was thinking, shit, what the hell are they on about? And Colin's track rider was sort of saying, "Oh, don't worry about those heroes. They're only taking the piss. They just saw how the mare was before she got to you." So not feeling that comfy in the track saddle with very, very short stirrups, I bridged up the reins and we went off. We would trot a few laps on the little sand track in the middle, and we sort of got going, and the rider from Colin said, "Right, are you ready? We'll go out and head out to the gallop." And the mare was super relaxed. So I had the feeling, that she was comfy, and I just sort of bridged the reins up and nestled them in on the neck. And then we sort of got going with quite a bit of speed. And on the outside, the grass track, they had some trials going on. So, and then all of a sudden, she turned the heat on. She's heard the thundering hooves on the grass of the other horses. She could hear the sort of jockeys yelling and the odd whip, and the adrenaline kicked in, and she turned the nitrous on, was going like a bat out of hell. And I just sort of put my very controlled, clear dressage face on, knowing that Colin would be in the tower staring down on me with the binoculars, and I just wanted to make this really good impression that everything was going fine. And she sort of came back to me, and then I could slowly test out the gearing that I'd thought I'd put in there, and then realized very quickly in that environment that all those settings were gone. And anyway, she came back to me, and then I was able to test, pulled around the outside, went forwards in front of the now 3 horses that were with us, because we'd went quite fast and caught up to a few more. And then I was able to bring her back and bring her in behind, and we slowed down to a trot, and we walked a couple of laps, and then I give the thumbs up to Colin in the tower, feeling pretty good about myself at that moment. We walked back to the stable, and Colin came back to the stable and sort of congratulated me on the job that I'd done with her. So, and at that point, my head obviously grew to a point where I was worried if I was going to fit in my car to drive home again. So I came the next day, and Colin asked if I'd get on another horse of his, so I got on this big bay with a white, wild, baldy eye. And the idea was that I would just ride with his rider, a really confident girl that obviously knew her job really well. It was the girl that I went out with on the first day. And I sort of was, really focused on explaining the tips to her. And I sort of went out on this big fella. And, I was then really focused on telling her exactly the operating manual for this little red mare that I'd had in training, and now she was going to take over and learn the operating instructions. And she said, "Oh, it's good that you're riding him, because maybe you can sort him out a bit." And I still didn't think much of it, because I was so focused on giving her, these perfect instructions that that the horse would go really well. So we got some instructions from Colin in the tower before he went up, and we sort of started to get going. And I was pretty pleased with the mare in the beginning. You know, we get going on the track, and the girl's having a really comfortable ride on this mare. She's sort of going steady, and I was explaining the gearing that I'd set up on them. This mare, he told me, Colin, when I was in the stable, when he brought it to my place, he said, now this mare, she's put in some unbelievable times, but without the jockey. So this mare could obviously either throw them off or turn a ton of speed on, and she was sort of going very fast, out of control. So I'd sort of tried to put this gearing in where, you know, I would make transitions and I would loosen the rein and they would slow down, and I would take a connection, and when they felt the bit, they would go forward. And as I would keep the connection and move the hands up the neck with the bridge rein, they would take the bit and stretch out and go and go and go more. And so we were going through this, you know, at speed now with the young mare. And as I said, I was pleased with the way it was going. You know, the rider from Colin was having a pleasant ride. And as we got sort of out the back, along the back straight, this big galloping steed with the one white baldy eye just sort of out of nowhere stopped from a gallop and span around like a frilled neck ninja and was galloping the other way, a 180 turn, without me. And I looked up and I could just see all the trainers in the towers looking through their binoculars at this bloke laying on the ground. So, and then the rider from Colin sort of rode up to me and said, yeah, that's the kind of stunts he likes to pull. So there I was thinking that I'd done a really great job on this mare, and I was very quickly brought down to the ground, earth again, after feeling I was doing such a great job. I remember walking back through the stable and I run into what was then my horse dentist, Mark Burnell, who was also very involved in the racing game and had a photographic memory. He could tell you the breeding of just about every racehorse in the country. And I didn't know that, but he was obviously the horse dentist for Colin too at that time. And I was walking back and ran into Mark, and he said, "Oh, Tristan, how you going? I heard you were riding this mare for Colin. How's it going? Is she doing well?" And me with my sand-stained riding pants and surely sand still in the grill from my helmet, I said, "Oh, yeah, really great. Righto, see you later." And I quickly headed off back to the car. Yeah, so with the mare being back, I was going, you know, I'd find myself down at the tab with Rob and looking at the screens, and I'd watch how the mare was doing, and I was happy that she was behaving, but she ran okay, but didn't show a lot of promise as a racehorse. So thinking that that would stay quiet, I was not expecting the call from Colin again. And it's now, people, that we get to the horse of the story, the influential horse. So Colin called me up and he said, "Oh, Tristan, I've got a horse here that you could probably help me with. He doesn't have any behavioral problems, but he's a little bit weak in the back, and we have some time now to do some pre-training, you know, in the lead up to the next season. And I just thought with your way of riding, you could help him to sort of strengthen up his back a bit." So of course I said, "Yeah, no problem." And a day or so later, the horse came down, and this little unassuming brown horse with no white, short front legs, and a kind of nice little cute head came off the truck. And he was very soft in his character. He sort of came off the truck and just stood really quietly. He was very quiet in the stable. We put him into the number 1 stable. I'd thrown all the horses out and cleaned and put new shavings in to make sure it was ready for Colin's horse coming down. And yeah, he was just a really quiet, had this quiet aura about him. And then I think within a couple of hours, Colin was there. And then he proceeded to tell me about this horse. And he said, this is possibly the best horse I've ever had. He told me what he'd paid for him as a yearling and what he'd won in prize money so far. And it was definitely the most expensive horse I'd had in the stables there at Nunagoon. And it was definitely the most expensive horse I was ever going to have there in the stables at Nunagoon. So now I could hear the frogs fart while I was sleeping in the middle of the night when something happened in the stable. And this little horse that stood in my stable was called El Segundo. And that was the first day that I'd met this little racehorse. As I said, this little brown, unassuming horse, which we were to find out later was a horse with an incredibly huge heart. I remember the first time my farrier came down, he called in Ian Fraser, Fraser. Fraser was always good for a yarn. He could also drink all the beer out of your fridge. Fraser was a top fella, and Fraser's probably the most positive man I've ever met. If you were, I would work a lot alone in the stable there. There's not many people that sort of came in to visit, so you're working day in, day out with the horses. And, Fraser would call in often, of course, to shoe the horses, but maybe in between if he was close by. And he was always good for a yarn, and he would always give positive energy and sort of give you sort of reflection of how you were doing and what you were building for yourself. And, good on you, fella, you're bloody doing a good job here. And Fraser was always a super positive influence for me at that time. We used to say Fraser was a big fella with bare hands and a lion heart. And I remember Fraser coming in saying, so where's this little El Segundo, with a ripper Aussie accent. And I said, he's there in the first box. And, he sort of walked over and he said, oh, gee, he's only a little chap, isn't he? And so the first few days I did a little groundwork, and which is what I called it back then. I'm not sure what I would call it now, but I remember him being quite shy and reserved in the first few days. And then after some time, he'd start with a little bit of banter, and he'd start to nudge me while I was tacking him up in the wash place, and he would start to sort of rub and reach out for contact in the work. The first time I rode him, I remember getting on and walking a bit and feeling like his feet were tied together. His shoelaces were tied together. He had these sort of really small little steps. And so I worked a little bit on the lifting of the front legs, which is what I'd learned from my influence of coming to Denmark and working with Morten Thompson. And then I would start with the first groundwork patterns, which I'd learnt from Wayne Banney, horseman that I got to privilege to work with at Jim and Emmy's place, which of course I was doing my bad version of his groundwork patterns. But then I would ride, sort of a lot of lateral work and shoulder ins and leg yield, and sort of just work on his flexibility and try to have the feeling that he was equal both sides, and he became loose and supple through the work. I remember being able to quite quickly start to do sort of working pirouettes. I even had a flying change on him. And I just remember he was a horse that just really loved to learn. He was really curious, and he sort of enjoyed the partnership all the time. He was a horse that would be standing then at the bars and looking for when he could come out. You would put him in the paddock and he was really relaxed, and if he heard you walking down the lane, he would come up to the fence and look to have the halter put on and to be brought in to do something. And after sort of a little bit of work, I sort of worked on him lifting the hind legs to give awareness. A lot of racehorses have the tendency to get into the pattern or compensation pattern of pulling themselves forward with the front leg. So we had sort of, they would get these huge triceps and sort of huge shoulders that would end up being restricting sort of a whole muscle mass that sort of stopped them from being free and really learning to stretch out. So after I'd sort of worked through these basic things, and some days in between I would sort of take him out and walk him on the road in between, or give him a hack out, just walking along the roads, the dirt roads there in Nanagoon, for a bit of a break in between. But his body started to develop quite well, and you could feel that he had sort of this empowerment from the body changing and the muscles building up. So after some time, the day came. The day came that would blow my brain and install the belief in horses that has actually never left me. I'd been, as I said, be walking him out on the roads. We had this, I can't remember exactly the name, but I think it was probably like the number 5 drain road in Nanagoon. We have a lot of number 5, I remember just the numbers of roads. It was called number 5 drain road. We had a lot of drains with the water running through. Those of you back in Australia be knowing exactly what I'm talking about. But it's basically, we had this sand road that after a little bit of rain was like this perfect working surface for horses. There was barely any cars that used to come down the road. And so it was sort of this long stretch for quite a number of kilometers. So I never told Colin about this experience. So if he ever gets to listen to the podcast, this will be the first time he hears it. But I was working on this gearing system that I was trying to teach them, where, as I said, with the red mare, I'd have the loose rein. When the rein was loose and relaxed, the horses would come back, and then the contact was the go, and then moving the reins up the neck to sort of get them to take the bit and stretch out. So connection meant go, and relaxation. So you weren't sort of having to manually hold them or wrestle them. The horses really learned the idea of taking themselves. This was the time to go. Nobody was telling them to go. Nobody was pulling or holding them back. It was really teaching them what it was to want to go, to want to take the bit and take you forward, to give you that experience and direction. And so working on that system, we started out a little bit in trot, and he started to stretch out a bit, which was good for the front legs in trot. And then we popped into a steady canter, and his ears were pricked, and he was going down this sand road with his ears up, looking like he was having the time of his life. I remember there being potatoes in the field, and, the sun was coming down on the potatoes, which the irrigator had just sprayed some water on. And you could just hear the wind through the trees. It was a really calm day with the sun out, and he was just enjoying himself. And I just sort of picked up the reins a little bit, and then El immediately took this connection and got into a little bit of speed. And I was just thinking, right at that very moment when I first picked up the connection and he started to go, I thought, I've never felt this kind of power from you before. We've been doing this relaxed work and being calm and being flexible and a little bit of canter and maybe a little bit forward, but I'd never felt that feeling when I picked up the rein and he went a little bit forward. That was the first time that I felt really a bit of power from him. Then I began to move the rein up the neck, and he began to lower his head, and in one moment the ears went back, and then this whoosh turned into an insane amount of speed, something I had never ever experienced before. Literally, the sound of the hooves went from a galloping rhythm into this thundering blur. He leveled out his body like a hornet. He was like this jet fighter. The water was streaming from my eyes. The tears were creating this total blur of the road. It was like driving in torrential rain in a car where you can't really see anything. My heart was racing. But for a moment, there was this total bliss. In the beginning, it was this rush of adrenaline, and then it sort of turned into this quiet moment. He'd sort of drawn me into the saddle where it was like he wasn't even touching the ground. It's this moment where if you were in a drag racer where you would get, the gravity would pull you in to the seat. And he was giving me this unique experience of his true spirit and what he was born to do. You know, I'd ridden track work a bit, as I said earlier, and I'd been fast on some horses before. But this experience just blew me away. I had really this feeling in that moment that there was no sound at a certain point. He was just taking me at such a speed and such fluency in his body that I was taken to another place. And I had the feeling that he was meaning to give me this experience. He was meaning for me to feel what he feels in his body and what he was born to do. After that moment, I just remember him just slowing down, and he pulled himself up. We were coming towards the end of the road. And then I could sort of hear his feet again. And he brought himself back. I didn't tell him to come back. I didn't try to stop him. He just came back, and I relaxed on the reins, and he put the ears forward. And then he just casually walked home. Like he was thinking, well, that was the hit out that I needed. And I never told anyone that story before. It was like I felt an experience that he had given me that no one else could have really understood. It was sort of a moment in time that I didn't really understand and couldn't really comprehend what had just gone on. So after that point, not long after, El Segundo went back, and he was possibly the greatest racehorse Colin Little had ever had in his very illustrious career. El Segundo was born on 2001, sired by Pins out of the mare Palos Verdes, which was a mare also Colin trained. He won in excess of $4 million in prize money. He won many prestigious Group 1 races, including the Yalumba Stakes, the Memsey Stakes, the Underwood Stakes, the FC Orr Stakes. But it was 2007, which was the highlight of his career. He was the winner of the Great Spring Carnival's WS Cox Plate in the year of 2007 at Moonee Valley. And to my records, he is the last horse to win the John F. Freenan Stakes and the Cox Plate double in one spring carnival. And there's a little quote, and I just remember reflecting back on that feeling and that sensation he gave me. You know, the Cox Plate is a really big deal in the Spring Carnival. You know, Spring Carnival in Australia is that season where everybody stops for racehorses. It's not, you know, people that are in horses or in racing. It's everybody. You know, it's also to do with fashion. It's to do with the time of year. Everybody is getting into what is really Australian: barbecue, beers, getting together, watching the races, having sweepstakes. You know, you put all the names in the hat. The Melbourne Cup, the #1 race of the Spring Carnival, the race of Australia, is the slogan is the race that stops a nation. I don't know if it's still that now, but that's definitely what it did to everybody in Australia. You know, builders, electricians, doctors, didn't matter what sort of career you were in or interests or hobbies you had. People all of a sudden in Spring Carnival became racehorse experts. You know, everybody knew who was going to be the winner. And so, you know, that sort of experience, and then to have a horse that you'd had in your stables and had the experience and privilege of working, go on to win a Cox Plate is a tremendous thing. And there's a quote here from Colin when he talks about the Cox Plate. He's reflecting back to talking to Luke Nolan, who was riding him. Luke Nolan rode him for most of, well, definitely the height of his career. Damien Oliver also rode him, and maybe Gauchi also rode him in the early stages. But I think Luke had the most rides with him and the most success for sure. Luke rode him for the winning of the Cox Plate. But Colin said that he could go very quickly. And standing in the mounting yard the day he won the Cox Plate, he knew that Luke had researched the race to death. But funny enough, I'd never spoken to him about the Cox Plate until a couple of minutes before the race. I knew that Luke had tipped the race upside down, but I just said to him, look, this horse will out-sprint anything. He will out-sprint any other horse in the race. So I want you to be cool. I don't want you to go too early. If you're in the length of them on the turn, you'll out-sprint them. And that's exactly the way it worked out.
Set to go. Ready, racing. They're off, and Miss Finland on the inside bounced very quickly. Devil Moon, Arata's Son, Wonderful World have begun okay as they steady down now. Coming down to the judge and going to the front, Devil Moon, Miss Finland Insider. Arata's Son is third and Eskimo Queen is fourth. Divine Madonna's up close on the inside of Wonderful World. El Segundo the middle. Then came Efficient, followed by Ladder the Man and Nicanero. Zipping, getting back from Marasco and Magic Cape out to a length and a half to Eskimo Queen. One further back running six is El Segundo. Two then over on the inside, Divine Madonna. Outside it, Ladder the Manor. One further back, Efficient, a length into Nicanero. 2 lengths to Zipping and the last pair, Marasco and Magic Cape. Off the bottom turn at the 800 metre mark. Harada Sun dictates the terms in the Cox Plate up the side. World's gone up third. Miss Finland trying to get off the fence fourth. El Segundo coming into it fifth now. Running on there, followed by Eskimo Queen. Divine Madonna getting out and further back, Ladder the Manor. Then came Efficient. It's a great race, 500 to go. The sprint is right on. Wonderful World, Harada Sun and Devil Moon in the minute. They're followed further back by El Segundo getting out and Divine Madonna running on. Then Miss Finland, they turn for home. Wonderful World's got its head in front of Harada Sun, and here comes El Segundo. El Segundo winding up after Wonderful World. El Segundo's gone to Wonderful World, followed by Harada Sun. El Segundo, some unfinished business from last year. He ducked in, but El Segundo wins the Cox Plate by 2 lengths.
And I remember after, a bit before that, actually the first race that that he had when he went back and he started to get into racing, it was at the Cranbourne racetrack, which was pretty close to me. And it's 20 minutes from where I lived. And it was the first and only race I ever saw him in the flesh. I remember standing quietly in the stands, my eyes glued to the yellow and black striped colours of the Colin Little Racing Stable with red sleeves and a red cap. So sitting in the stands, beady-eyed, seeing those colours go into the barriers, waiting for the green light on, racing, and seeing him jumped out. And he jumped away clean, and he moved into his steady position, which was often sort of a midway back on the rail. And he'd sort of just cruise quietly in amongst the field. And he kept that position going into the back straight. I could hear the race caller saying, and El Segundo still going steady midfield. And then he'd go through the rest of the field. And then coming into the turn, he'd just start to creep forward and into the straight. And then as they got in the straight, boom, he just turned that characteristic streamlined hornet armour with his ears back, and he just pushed through the field. And at that moment, it was like the rest of the field had just given up. And the straight at Cranbourne was not very long. So when you're sort of midfield and you've maybe got 6, 7, 8 horses to pass, and you've not got a lot of room to get there, and they've made the turn, and literally, I saw the shape in his body And it was at that moment that I got the feeling back of when I was sitting on him. Everything went quiet. I remember not being able to hear anything, and I could just see his body shape, and I could start to feel what he was feeling. And getting really low down, the body really horizontal, with his ears back, just pushing through the field. And flying past them, like I say, as if they'd given up. And then he hit the winning post far ahead of the rest. And then I just remember the crowd roaring. And, you know, the sound coming back. Sound of the caller, the sound of the people. And then my squeal like a young boy, yes, amongst the crowds not heard. And I walked directly from that spot that I was standing in the stands and went back to the car park, just knowing that I was blessed to have had the opportunity to experience a one of a kind. So having never seen him race in real life, and then to see him that one time was actually enough for me. I knew at that moment that he was one of a kind. And looking back on it now, I realize what he had showed me, and that was the true will. You know, he was a horse that wanted to be a racehorse. He wanted to race. He wanted to win more than the jockey. And I say it now quite often, you know, in my clinics and demos, that where I'm trying now to, you know, teach the dressage horses and to give them a will and an empowerment to want to be a dressage horse more than me or more than the riders I'm helping. And as I went through this story in my mind, I realized that I think that's where the belief of that has come from. You know, to experience a horse with such will and such a spirit for wanting to do what he was bred and put on this earth, I believe, to do, was an empowering thing to experience. And that's what stayed with me for such a long time. And since actually going through this podcast, I've also recently learned that Colin Little has now retired this year in March from the sport of kings. At the age of 73, the historic race course at Caulfield has closed, I think due to property development. You know, Caulfield Racecourse is, you know, very prestige, or the value of the property there, the land there, is extremely high. You know, it's very close to the centre of Melbourne. You know, very expensive living and apartments and housing in that area. And of course, a racecourse takes up a huge amount of land. So, you know, the historic standing of the Caulfield Racecourse is going to be no more. And so that's how I understand it. And Colin had to move out of his long-time home at Lord Lodge at Caulfield Racecourse, which he had made his legacy as one of the greatest Australian racehorse trainers, or definitely of my era living in Australia. So in the light of knowing this new information about Colin's retirement, Colin, I just want to wish you all the best. And I want to thank you for your experiences and the pleasure of meeting you and your horses. So guys, that's my story. I hope that it's inspired some of you to maybe look back at some of the horses you've had the pleasure of working with. And as you go on, of course, you have a certain sense of, in the moment, what they might be teaching you or what you might draw from it. But being able to look back, you know, with everybody learns and develops and gets into a different space in their mind. You have different skills and different ideas as you're in different stages of your life. But for me, it's an empowering thing to look back and reminisce about sort of experiences, and with the knowledge I have now, what it really gave me, what it really meant. And yeah, I hope to do more of these about the special horses in my life. See you next time.
Then followed by Legion. El Segundo still looking for room. He's got towards the middle of the track, but he's under hard riding. Now El Segundo's got room. Then Legion, Bow Under in front. El Segundo's gobbling him up though, and the favourite will get there.
Sun are coming with their runs now. El Segundo, Arata Sun. They're going to get to Chingway Chino. El Segundo and Arata Sun, stride for stride. El Segundo, the widest runner. Serenade Rose trying to get out from Testifiable and Pompey Ruler. In the straight, here comes El Segundo. Oh, look at him go now. He's let him down. He's raced to Polar Bear. Then Casual Pass and further back Serenade Rose. But El Segundo, here's the favourite.